The old bookstore, with its comforting aroma of aging paper and leather, was Elara's sanctuary. It was a place where the world outside, with its jarring noises and expectations, faded into the background. She ran a hand over the spine of a worn copy of Wuthering Heights, the familiar texture a small comfort. It had been another long day of lectures, and all she wanted was to lose herself in a world of windswept moors and passionate, albeit destructive, love. A shadow fell over her, and she didn't need to look up to know who it was. The subtle, clean scent of rain and pine always announced his presence before he ever said a word. "Find anything good, Eli?" Liam's voice was a low, comforting rumble, a stark contrast to the often shrill chatter of her college classmates. She turned, a smile instantly gracing her lips. Liam was, for lack of a better word, beautiful. Not in the delicate, fragile way some men were, but in a way that was all sharp angles and lean muscle, a predator's grace in a deceptively calm package. His dark hair was a perpetually tousled mess, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a depth that always seemed to be hiding a universe of secrets. He was the captain of the university's swim team, the golden boy everyone either wanted to be or be with. He was also her best friend, and the keeper of a secret she guarded as fiercely as her own. "Just browsing," she replied, her voice soft. "Trying to escape the thrilling world of macroeconomics." He chuckled, the sound a warm vibration in the quiet aisle. "I'm sure the world of brooding heroes and tragic heroines is a much better alternative." He leaned against the bookshelf, his proximity a familiar comfort. They had been inseparable since their freshman year, a bond forged over late-night study sessions and a shared love for bad horror movies. She knew him better than anyone, or so she thought. She knew his favorite coffee order, the way his left eyebrow twitched when he was lying, and of course, the fact that the endless stream of girls who threw themselves at him held no appeal. It had been a quiet confession one rainy afternoon, tucked away in their favorite corner of the library. He told her he was gay, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. She had simply taken his hand, her own fears and insecurities melting away in the face of his vulnerability. From that moment on, a fierce, protective instinct had taken root in her heart. She was his confidant, his shield against a world that wasn't always kind to those who were different. "You ready to go?" he asked, his eyes scanning the bookstore with a subtle alertness she had grown accustomed to. It was one of his many quirks, the way he always seemed to be aware of his surroundings, a quiet sentinel at her side. "Almost," she said, finally pulling the copy of Wuthering Heights from the shelf. "I just need to pay for this, and then we can subject ourselves to another one of your terrible movie choices." He grinned, a flash of white in the dimly lit store. "Hey, Mega Shark vs. Crocosaurus is a cinematic masterpiece, and you know it." She rolled her eyes, but the affection in her tone was undeniable. As they made their way to the counter, the bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of a new customer. A shiver, cold and unwelcome, traced its way down Elara's spine. A man stood in the doorway, his frame massive and imposing. He was dressed in dark, expensive-looking clothes, but it was his eyes that held her captive. They were a pale, icy blue, and they were fixed on Liam with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand on end. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sudden, suffocating silence that seemed to swallow the comforting atmosphere of the bookstore whole. Liam, who had been laughing just a moment before, was now rigid, his body a coiled spring of tension. The easygoing smile was gone, replaced by a hard, unreadable expression. He subtly moved, placing himself between Elara and the stranger, a protective gesture that was both reassuring and terrifying. The man's lips curled into a sneer, a look of pure disdain on his handsome yet cruel face. Elara didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the quiet sanctuary of her bookstore had just been invaded by something old and dangerous, and her life was about to change forever. Chapter 2: A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. The air in the bookstore crackled with an unspoken animosity. The large man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She could feel the warmth radiating from Liam's back, a solid wall between her and the source of her fear. "Well, well, what do we have here?" The stranger's voice was a low, menacing growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. His gaze flickered from Liam to Elara, a dismissive, contemptuous look that made her feel small and insignificant. Liam's voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of its usual warmth. It was flat and cold, a chilling contrast to the man she knew. "What do you want, Kale?" The man, Kale, let out a short, humorless laugh. "What I want is for you to remember your place, pup. You've been running with this, human, for far too long." The way he said human was like an insult, a venomous spit of a word. Elara bristled, her fear momentarily overshadowed by a surge of anger. Who was this man to talk about her, to talk about Liam, with such open hostility? Before she could utter a word, however, Kale's attention was solely on Liam again. "The Alpha is growing impatient," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more threatening than a shout. "He wants you back in the fold. This little game of yours is over." "Alpha? Fold?" The words made no sense to Elara, but they seemed to have a profound effect on Liam. A muscle in his jaw twitched, and his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He looked like a cornered animal, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and for the first time, a sliver of doubt, a tiny crack in the foundation of their friendship, began to form in Elara's mind. There was more to Liam than he had let on, a whole other world of secrets he had kept hidden from her. Kale took another step, closing the distance between them. He was so close now that Elara could smell the cloying, musky scent of his cologne, a stark contrast to Liam's clean, earthy fragrance. "Don't make me drag you back, Liam. It would be unpleasant for both of you." His gaze flickered to Elara once more, a silent threat that sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through her. It was in that moment that Elara found her voice, a small, trembling thing, but a voice nonetheless. "Leave him alone," she said, her words barely a whisper. Kale's icy blue eyes snapped to hers, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "And who are you to tell me what to do, little girl?" "I'm his friend," she said, her voice gaining a little more strength. "And I'm telling you to leave him alone." His laughter this time was a full-throated booming sound that echoed through the silent bookstore. It was a sound of pure amusement, as if the idea of her, a mere human, standing up to him was the most ridiculous thing he had ever heard. Liam's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around Elara's arm in a surprisingly strong grip. "Eli, don't," he warned, his voice a low growl. But she wouldn't be silenced. Not when this man was threatening her best friend. She pulled her arm from his grasp, her eyes blazing with a newfound courage. "I don't know who you are or what you want with him," she said, her voice clear and steady now, "but you have no right to talk to us like that." Kale's smile faltered, replaced by a look of genuine surprise, which quickly morphed into a sneer. "Brave," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "But foolish." He took a menacing step towards her, and this time, it was Liam who moved, placing himself squarely in front of her, his body a shield. "Enough, Kale." Liam's voice was a low, dangerous growl, a sound Elara had never heard from him before. It was a sound that sent a shiver of a different kind down her spine, a primal fear that had nothing to do with the man in front of them and everything to do with the man at her back. "This has nothing to do with her, doesn't it?" Kale's eyes glinted with a malicious light. "You've been hiding among them, pretending to be one of them. You've forgotten who you are, what you are." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was meant only for Liam, but Elara caught a few of the words that would forever change the way she saw her best friend. "You are an alpha, Liam. And it's time you started acting like one." Chapter 3: The Unraveling of a Lie. The weight of Kale's words hung in the air long after he had gone, a toxic cloud that suffocated the once comforting silence of the bookstore. Elara's mind reeled, trying to make sense of the fragmented pieces of the conversation she had just witnessed. "Alpha. Fold. Pretending to be one of them." The words echoed in her ears, a discordant symphony of confusion and fear. Liam stood with his back to her, his shoulders slumped in a way she had never seen before. The confident, easygoing boy she had known for years seemed to have vanished, replaced by a stranger, a man burdened by secrets she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "Liam," she ventured, her voice small in the vast emptiness of the store. "What was that all about? Who was that man?" He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. The familiar stormy sea was now a tempest, a swirling vortex of emotions she couldn't decipher. There was fear, yes, but there was also something else, something deeper and more primal, a raw vulnerability that tore at her heart. "Eli," he began, his voice raspy, "we need to go. Now." He grabbed her hand, his grip a little too tight, and pulled her towards the exit. "But what about my book?" she protested weakly, her mind still struggling to catch up with the sudden, jarring shift in their reality. "Forget the book," he said, his voice sharp with an urgency that bordered on panic. "We need to get out of here." He practically dragged her out of the bookstore, the bell above the door chiming a frantic farewell. The cool night air was a shock to her system, but it did little to clear the fog of confusion that clouded her mind. They walked in silence, the sound of their footsteps a stark contrast to the thundering of her own heart. They didn't stop until they reached the familiar comfort of her small apartment, a cozy space filled with books and plants, a reflection of her own quiet nature. Liam paced the length of her living room, a restless energy radiating from him, a caged animal desperate for escape. "Liam, please talk to me," she pleaded, her voice breaking on the last word. "You're scaring me." He stopped his pacing, his hands running through his already messy hair in a gesture of pure frustration. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a torment that made her want to wrap her arms around him and never let go. I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice laced with a despair that was utterly foreign to him. "Start with alpha," she said, the word tasting strange on her tongue. "He called you an alpha. What does that mean?" He let out a long, shaky breath, the sound a testament to the internal battle he was waging. He sank onto her sofa, his head in his hands, the picture of a man utterly defeated. "It's complicated," he mumbled into his palms. "I don't care," she said, kneeling in front of him, her hands resting on his knees. "I'm your best friend, Liam. You can tell me anything. You know that." He looked up at her then, and the raw emotion in his eyes was almost her undoing. There was a desperation there, a plea for understanding, for acceptance. "I'm not who you think I am, Eli," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not normal." "I know you're not normal," she said, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. "You're kind and loyal, and you have the worst taste in movies of anyone I have ever met. You're anything but normal." A ghost of a smile touched his own lips, a fleeting glimpse of the boy she knew and loved. "No, Eli," he said, his voice serious once more. "It's more than that. I'm different. In a way you can't even imagine." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say next. "The things Kale said, they're true. I'm an alpha, and I'm not human." The words hung in the air between them, a chasm that threatened to swallow them both. Elara stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of disbelief and a dawning, terrifying understanding. The way he always seemed to know when she was upset, the way he could hear things no one else could, the way he moved with a grace and power that was almost inhuman. It all started to click into place, a puzzle she had never even known she was a part of. "What are you?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He looked at her, his eyes pleading with her to believe him, to not be afraid of him. "I'm a werewolf, Eli," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "And Kale. He's one of us. And he's here to take me back." Chapter 4. The Weight of a Secret. The confession hung in the air, a living, breathing entity that sucked all the oxygen from the room. A werewolf. The word, so steeped in folklore and fantasy, sounded absurd on his lips, a line from one of the bad horror movies they so often watched together. But the look in his eyes, the raw, unadulterated fear and vulnerability, told her he was speaking a truth he had carried alone for far too long. Elara stared at him, her mind a blank canvas, unable to process the vibrant, chaotic colors he had just thrown at it. A werewolf. Her Liam, the boy who helped her study for exams, who brought her soup when she was sick, who knew her deepest, darkest secrets, was a creature of the night, a monster from a child's nightmare. She should have been scared. She should have screamed, or run, or done any of the things a normal person would do when confronted with such an impossible revelation. But as she looked at him, at the boy who was her anchor in a world that often felt like a raging sea, all she could feel was a profound, aching sadness. A sadness for the secret he had been forced to carry, for the loneliness he must have felt, for the fear that was now so clearly etched on his face. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and placed it on his cheek. He flinched at her touch, as if expecting to be struck, to be rejected. But she simply held her hand there, her thumb gently stroking his skin, a silent reassurance that she was still here, that she wasn't going anywhere. "A werewolf," she repeated, her voice a soft whisper in the quiet of her apartment. The word sounded no less strange, no less impossible, but it was a truth she was slowly, tentatively beginning to accept. He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers, searching for any sign of fear, of repulsion. He found none. Only a quiet, unwavering acceptance that was so quintessentially Elara, so quintessentially her. "My family," he began, his voice still shaky, "we're different. We're a pack. And I was supposed to be the next alpha." He let out a humorless laugh, a sound filled with a bitterness she had never heard from him before. "Some alpha I turned out to be. I ran away. I couldn't. I didn't want that life." He told her everything then, the words tumbling out of him in a torrent of pent-up emotions. He told her about his first shift, a terrifying, painful experience that had left him feeling like a monster in his own skin. He told her about the strict, suffocating hierarchy of the pack, the constant pressure to be strong, to be dominant, to be something he was not. He told her about his father, the current alpha, a man he both feared and respected, a man who would never understand his son's desire for a normal life, a life of his own choosing. And he told her about Kale, his father's enforcer, a wolf who reveled in the power and brutality of their world, a wolf who saw Liam's desire for a different life as a weakness, a betrayal. As he spoke, a new understanding began to dawn on Elara. His overprotective nature, his almost preternatural awareness of his surroundings, his quiet strength. It all made sense now. He wasn't just being a good friend, he was being a protector, a guardian, a wolf watching over his what? She didn't dare to put a name to the feeling that was slowly blooming in her chest, a feeling that was both terrifying and exhilarating in its intensity. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice filled with a gentle reproach. "All this time, you've been carrying this alone." He looked at her, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "How could I?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "How could I tell you that your best friend is a monster? I was afraid you would hate me, that you would be scared of me." "I could never hate you, Liam," she said, her voice fierce with a conviction that came from the very core of her being. "And I'm not afraid of you." And she wasn't. As she looked at him, she didn't see a monster. She saw her Liam, her best friend, the boy who had stood by her through thick and thin, the boy who was now trusting her with his most vulnerable, most dangerous secret. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a hug that was both a comfort and a promise. A promise that he was not alone, that they would face this together, whatever this was. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with the force of his silent sobs, and in that moment, in the quiet sanctuary of her small apartment, two worlds, once separate and distinct, collided and merged, creating a new reality, a new future, a future they would have to navigate together. Chapter 5. A New Kind of Danger. The next few days passed in a strange, surreal haze. The world outside Elara's apartment continued on its mundane course. Students hurried to classes, cars honked in the morning traffic, the scent of autumn leaves filled the air. But within the four walls of her small living room, a new reality had taken root. Liam was a constant presence, a shadow at her side. He walked her to and from her classes, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, a low, almost imperceptible growl rumbling in his chest whenever anyone got too close. He slept on her couch, a silent guardian in the darkness, and she would often wake in the middle of the night to find him staring out the window, his silhouette a stark, lonely figure against the moonlit sky. The easy, comfortable banter that had once been the hallmark of their friendship was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful tension. They talked, of course, but their conversations were now tinged with an undercurrent of fear, of uncertainty. He told her more about his world, a world of ancient laws and traditions, of pack dynamics and territorial disputes. He told her about the different types of shifters, the rivalries, the alliances. It was a world that was both fascinating and terrifying, a world she was now, inexplicably, a part of. She, in turn, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, for both their sakes. She made him his favorite coffee, forced him to watch a particularly terrible B-movie about a giant, radioactive hamster, and quizzed him on his macroeconomics homework, a subject he was now failing spectacularly due to his preoccupation with their newfound predicament. But there was no denying the fear that lingered in the corners of her mind, a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. The memory of Cale's icy blue eyes, of his cruel, mocking smile, was a recurring nightmare that haunted her waking hours and her dreams. One evening, as they were huddled together on her couch, a textbook opened between them. A sudden, loud knock on the door made them both jump. Liam was on his feet in an instant, his body tense, his eyes flashing with a primal, animalistic light that still sent a shiver down her spine, a shiver that was no longer entirely born of fear. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice a low, commanding growl. He moved to the door, his movements silent and fluid, a predator on the prowl. He looked through the peephole, and a wave of relief, so palpable she could almost taste it, washed over him. He opened the door to reveal a young woman with fiery red hair and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She was dressed in a pair of ripped jeans and a faded band t-shirt, a stark contrast to the dark, imposing figure of Cale. "Maya," Liam said, his voice laced with a mixture of surprise and relief. "What are you doing here?" The woman, Maya, pushed her way past him, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. "You have to get out of here, Liam," she said, her voice a breathless, urgent whisper. "He's coming. My father. He's coming for you." "Your father?" Liam asked, his voice a low growl of disbelief. "Why would he?" "He knows, Liam," she said, her voice breaking on a sob. "He knows you told her everything." Her gaze flickered to Elara, who was standing frozen in the middle of the living room, her heart pounding a frantic tattoo against her ribs. "He sees her as a threat," Maya continued, her voice trembling. "A weakness. He's not just coming to take you back, Liam. He's coming to eliminate the threat." The unspoken words hung in the air, a death sentence for the girl who had done nothing more than love a boy with a secret she was never meant to know. The fragile sense of safety they had managed to build within the walls of her apartment shattered into a million pieces, and a new, more immediate danger, a danger that was no longer a faceless, nameless threat, but a man with a name and a face, a man who was coming for them, for her, descended upon them, a suffocating shroud of darkness. The game had changed, and the stakes were now higher than either of them could have ever imagined. Chapter 6: The Frantic Escape. The words "eliminate the threat" echoed in the small apartment, a death knell for the life Elara had always known. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her shock. Maya's frantic eyes were fixed on Liam, but Elara knew the warning was for her. She was the threat. She was the one they wanted to remove. Liam moved with a speed that was startling. "We have to go. Now." He grabbed Elara's arm, his touch firm but gentle, pulling her towards her bedroom. "Grab a bag. Essentials only. A change of clothes, your phone, wallet. Nothing else. We have 5 minutes. Maybe less." His voice was a commander's, calm and authoritative, cutting through the fog of her fear. She nodded, her body moving on autopilot. She fumbled for her worn backpack, her hands shaking as she pulled clothes from her drawers, not even registering what she was grabbing. A worn sweater, a pair of jeans, a crumpled t-shirt. It all felt so mundane, so ridiculously normal in the face of this monstrous reality. Her eyes fell on the copy of Wuthering Heights lying on her nightstand. A relic from another lifetime, a lifetime that had ended only an hour ago in a quiet bookstore. With a sob catching in her throat, she shoved it into her bag. When she emerged, Liam was already by the door, a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Maya was pacing nervously, wringing her hands. "Cale was with my father when he found out," she explained, her voice a hurried whisper. "He was pleased. He's been looking for an excuse to bring you in by force. They won't be gentle, Liam." "They never are," Liam muttered, his jaw tight. He glanced at Elara, his stormy eyes softening for a fraction of a second. "I'm so sorry, Eli." "Don't be," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We're in this together, remember?" A flicker of a smile, a ghost of his old self, touched his lips. It was gone as quickly as it came. "Maya, your car?" "Down in the alley behind the building," she replied. "It's not much, but it'll get us out of the city." "It'll have to do," Liam said. He cracked open the door, peering into the empty hallway. The silence was more terrifying than any noise. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. "Okay. We move fast and we don't make a sound. Elara, you stay between us." She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. The journey down the 3 flights of stairs was the longest of her life. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant siren, sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. Liam moved in front, a silent, graceful shadow, while Maya brought up the rear, her own senses on high alert. They slipped out the back door and into the cool, damp air of the alley. A beat-up, dark blue sedan sat waiting, its engine already humming. As Maya fumbled with the keys to unlock the doors, a sound from the front of the building froze them in their tracks. The heavy thud of multiple car doors slamming shut. "They're here," Maya breathed, her face pale in the dim light. "Get in," Liam ordered, pushing Elara into the back seat and sliding in beside her. Maya jumped into the driver's seat, her hands trembling as she put the car in gear. The tires screeched on the wet pavement as she peeled out of the alley, turning sharply onto a side street just as a pair of sleek, black SUVs pulled up to the curb in front of Elara's apartment building. Elara risked a look back. In the glow of the streetlights, she saw several large figures emerge from the vehicles. One of them, taller and broader than the rest, was unmistakable. Kale. He looked up, his head snapping in their direction as if he could sense them, his icy eyes seeming to pierce right through the darkness and into her soul. She shrank back into her seat, pressing herself against Liam's side. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close, a solid, warm presence in the terrifying darkness. His scent of rain and pine filled her senses, a small, familiar comfort in a world that had been turned upside down. As the city lights blurred into a stream of color behind them, Elara knew one thing with a chilling certainty: there was no going back. Her old life was gone, swallowed by the secrets of a world she was only just beginning to understand, and her only hope for survival was the boy-turned-wolf who held her tightly in the dark. Chapter 7. The Shelter in the Storm. They drove for hours, the city's glow giving way to the inky blackness of the countryside. Maya drove with a focused intensity, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, while Liam stared out the back window, a silent sentinel watching for any sign of pursuit. Elara, huddled between them, drifted in and out of a restless, fear-filled sleep, the image of Kale's predatory gaze burned into her mind. Finally, as the first faint hints of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gray and lavender, Maya turned off the main highway and onto a winding, unpaved road. The car bumped and jostled, surrounded by a dense forest of pine and oak. After another 10 minutes, she pulled up to a small, isolated cabin, barely visible amongst the trees. It was old and rustic, with a stone chimney and a wide, covered porch. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, a stark contrast to the nightmare they were living. "My grandmother's," Maya explained as she cut the engine. "No one's been here in years. No electricity, no phone line. But there's a well for water and a wood-burning stove. We should be safe here for a little while." The relief was so profound it was almost painful. Inside, the cabin was dusty and smelled of old wood and cold stone, but it was a shelter. A sanctuary. While Maya worked to get a fire started in the large stone fireplace, Liam inspected the perimeter, his movements restless and agitated. Elara sank onto a threadbare armchair, the adrenaline that had been coursing through her veins for hours finally ebbing away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. The reality of her situation washed over her in a dizzying wave. She had fled her home, her life, everything she had ever known, and was now a fugitive, hunted by creatures she hadn't known existed a week ago. A sob, thick and heavy, escaped her lips. Liam was at her side in an instant, kneeling in front of her, his stormy eyes filled with a desperate apology. "Eli, I am so sorry. You should never have been dragged into this." "It's not your fault," she whispered, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "I wouldn't want to be anywhere else." The words were true, she realized with a jolt. As terrifying as this was, the thought of facing it without him was infinitely worse. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing away a stray tear. His touch was warm and steady, a grounding force in her swirling chaos. "You're the bravest person I know," he said, his voice a low, husky rumble. The air between them shifted, the space suddenly charged with an emotion that went far beyond friendship. The fear and adrenaline had stripped away their usual pretenses, leaving their connection raw and exposed. She was intensely aware of his proximity, of the clean, earthy scent of him, of the way his eyes searched hers, as if seeking an answer to a question he hadn't yet dared to ask. Her heart, which she thought couldn't possibly beat any faster, found a new, frantic rhythm. "We need to talk about my father," Maya said, her voice cutting through the charged silence. She had managed to coax a small, crackling fire to life, and its warm glow pushed back against the morning chill. "You need to understand who you're up against." Liam pulled away reluctantly, his hand dropping from Elara's face, leaving her skin tingling from his touch. He sat on the hearth, his expression grim. "Ronan is traditional," he began, the name of his father sounding like a curse. "He's a tyrant," Maya corrected bluntly. "He rules the pack with an iron fist. Tradition, law, and bloodline are all that matter to him. He believes shifters are superior, that humans are weak, disposable. The idea of you," she said, her gaze shifting to Elara, "being privy to our secrets, of having a hold over his heir. He sees it as a contamination. An unacceptable risk." "He won't stop," Liam added, his voice heavy. "He will hunt us until he has me back under his control, and you." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. The firelight danced across their faces, casting long, flickering shadows on the cabin walls. In that small, rustic room, miles from anything familiar, Elara looked from Maya's worried face to Liam's tormented one. The danger was real, the threat immense, but so was the fierce, protective feeling blooming in her chest. She was no longer just Liam's friend, a passive observer in his secret life. She was a part of it now. This was her fight, too. She met Liam's gaze across the flickering flames, a silent vow passing between them. They would face this storm together. Chapter 8: The Scars We Carry. The first day in the cabin was a blur of exhaustion and wary adjustment. They secured the small dwelling as best they could, barricading the single door at night and taking turns on watch, though Liam insisted on taking the longest shifts. Sleep, when it came for Elara, was shallow and plagued by nightmares of icy blue eyes and the screech of tires on pavement. She woke on the second morning to the smell of wood smoke and the quiet sound of Liam chopping wood outside. Peeking through the grimy window, she watched him. He moved with an efficient, powerful grace, the axe rising and falling in a steady rhythm. With his shirt off in the cool morning air, she could see the defined muscles of his back and shoulders, a testament to the strength he usually kept so carefully concealed. It was a jarring reminder that the boy who loved bad movies and struggled with economics was also a creature of immense physical power. When he came back inside, his skin glistening with a light sheen of sweat, he found her nursing a cup of lukewarm water. He offered her a small, tired smile. "Did you sleep at all?" "A little," she lied. "You should rest. You were up all night." "I don't need much sleep," he said, a casual statement that held a world of non-human meaning. He sat across from her at the small, rickety table, his presence filling the small space. A long, faded scar ran diagonally across his left shoulder blade, a silvery track against his tan skin. She had never noticed it before. "Where did you get that?" she asked softly, nodding towards his back. His hand went to the scar, a reflexive, unconscious movement. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a shadow of a memory he clearly didn't want to relive. "It was my first challenge," he said, his voice low. "For rank within the pack. I was 15. Elara's breath hitched. 15. At 15, her biggest worry had been a math test. "Someone did that to you?" "Kale," he answered, and the name was a venomous spit. "My father arranged it. He said it was to forge me in the fires of conflict, to make me a worthy heir. Kale was older, stronger. He enjoyed teaching me a lesson in pain." He looked at her, his stormy eyes reflecting the firelight. "That was the day I started planning to leave. I realized my father wasn't trying to build me up. He was trying to break me down and reshape me into a copy of himself. A monster." The raw pain in his voice was a physical blow. This was the root of it all, the fear, the desperation to escape, the fierce rejection of his own nature. It wasn't just about wanting a normal life, It was about escaping a brutal, abusive one. He then told her the rest, the part he had been holding back. He explained that in their world, an alpha's primary duty was to ensure the continuation of the pack through a strong bloodline. An alpha was expected to choose a powerful mate, a female shifter, and produce heirs. My father finding out I'm gay, it's not just a disappointment to him, Eli. It's a fundamental betrayal of my purpose. In his eyes, I am broken. Defective. An alpha who cannot produce an heir is no alpha at all. It threatens the very stability of the pack he's spent his life building. This was the context for her words in the bookstore. By defending his right to a relationship where he couldn't have children, she had, in the language of his people, publicly confirmed his unsuitability as a leader. She hadn't just angered a father, she had challenged the entire structure of a society built on strength and procreation. "Oh, Liam," she whispered, her heart aching for him. "That's not a burden you should ever have had to carry alone." "But I did," he said, his voice thick with years of concealed pain. "Until you." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. His skin was warm, his grip strong and reassuring. "You're the only person in my entire life who has looked at all the parts of me, even the parts one hate, and not run away." In the flickering firelight of the isolated cabin, surrounded by danger, Elara felt a profound shift in the foundation of her world. The boy she had sworn to protect was protecting her. And the love she felt for him, a love she had always defined as friendship, was transforming into something deeper, fiercer, and infinitely more complicated. It was a love that didn't care about bloodlines or pack laws. It was a love that saw the boy, the man and the wolf, and accepted all of it. And in this dangerous new world, that love might be the only thing that could save them both. Chapter 9. The Whispers of the Woods. 3 days bled into 4. A fragile routine formed within the confines of the cabin. Maya would venture out every other day, returning with meager supplies. Canned goods, bottled water, and news from the world they had left behind. Her reports were grim. Liam's father, Ronan, had officially declared him a rogue, a traitor to the pack. A bounty had been placed on his return, and a special price offered for the human companion who had led him astray. They were no longer just being pursued, they were being actively hunted. The forest, once a symbol of sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of anxiety through Elara. Liam was even more on edge. He rarely spoke, communicating more in low growls and watchful glances. He spent hours patrolling the woods around the cabin, his senses stretched to their limits, a wolf testing the boundaries of its territory. Elara's fear was a constant companion, but it was overshadowed by a growing worry for Liam. The strain was wearing on him. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and he moved with a coiled tension that never eased. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the enemies hunting them, and against the very nature he had tried so hard to deny. On the 5th day, Maya returned earlier than expected, her face etched with a new kind of fear. "We have to move," she said, bursting through the door without preamble. "I was followed. I'm sure of it. I took every precaution, but I smelled another wolf near the turnoff from the highway. One of my father's trackers." Panic flared in Elara's chest. "Are they coming here?" "They will be," Liam said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was already grabbing their bags, his movements swift and decisive. "They'll follow her scent trail. We have a few hours at most." "I know a place," Maya said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's an old abandoned ranger station, deeper in the mountains. It's harder to get to, but it's more defensible. We have to go now, before they can surround us." The escape was a frantic, desperate scramble. There was no time for careful planning, only for flight. They plunged into the dense woods, Maya in the lead, Liam right behind Elara, his hand a constant, reassuring pressure on the small of her back. The forest floor was a treacherous carpet of roots and rocks, and the dense canopy of leaves blocked out the sun, casting the world in a perpetual twilight. They moved for what felt like hours, the only sounds the pounding of their feet, their ragged breaths, and the ominous silence of the woods. Elara's lungs burned, and her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed on, fueled by adrenaline and the terrified knowledge of what was behind them. As dusk began to settle, Liam suddenly stopped, pulling Elara to a halt behind him. He held up a hand, his head cocked, his body utterly still. "Wait," he breathed. "What is it?" Maya whispered, turning back. "Something's wrong." Liam's eyes scanned the surrounding trees, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. "The scents. They're all around us. Not behind us. They're ahead." A chilling realization dawned on them all at once. They hadn't been followed. They had been herded. Maya's face crumpled in horror and dawning comprehension. The tracker. His scent wasn't on my trail. It was a lure. Oh gods, they knew I would come here. They knew I would lead you to the station. Her voice broke. "It's a trap." As if on cue, figures began to emerge from the deepening shadows of the woods. Large, menacing silhouettes stepping out from behind ancient oaks and granite boulders, their movements silent, coordinated, and utterly predatory. They formed a loose circle, cutting off any chance of escape. Leading them, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face, was Kale. "Nowhere left to run, pup," Kale sneered, his icy blue eyes glinting in the dim light. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze locking onto Elara. He sniffed the air, his lip curling in disgust. The hostile figure snarled. "What are you doing with his type?" Chapter 10. The Alpha's Roar. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Kale's question hung in the air, thick with contempt and menace. The circle of shifters tightened, their collective gaze a heavy weight on Elara's shoulders. She was the anomaly, the break in their pattern, the human who didn't belong. Fear, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze her, but seeing the sneer on Kale's face as he looked at Liam ignited something else inside her, a defiant, protective rage. She pushed her way past Liam's restraining arm, her chin held high as she stepped forward to face the monster-like creature. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was surprisingly clear and steady when she spoke. "Just because he likes relationships where he can't make babies doesn't mean he's not human." The words, born of a desperate attempt to defend Liam's secret, the only secret she thought he had, rang out in the sudden silence. It was the wrong defense, for the wrong secret, in the worst possible moment. The shifters around them exchanged confused, then darkly amused glances. Kale's smirk widened into a full-blown, vicious grin. Someone groaned from behind her, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. It was Liam. I'm not human," he said, his voice strained, each word a torment. "And you just made my position a lot harder, with the whole not bearing children thing." The implication of her words slammed into Kale with the force of a physical blow, his amusement vanishing, replaced by a look of cold, hard fury. Elara had just confirmed his, and the Alpha's, greatest fear. She hadn't just stumbled into their world, she had unwittingly testified against their future leader in a court of wolves. "So, it's true," Kale growled, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "The Alpha's line ends with you. A weak, pathetic stray who consorts with humans." His eyes flickered to Elara with chilling finality. "We'll correct this mistake. Starting with her." He nodded to two of the shifters on his left. "Take the girl." Time seemed to slow down. The two wolves started forward, their movements fluid and predatory. Elara was frozen, her mind screaming but her body refusing to move. This was it. This was how it ended. But then, something changed. A sound ripped through the forest, a sound unlike anything Elara had ever heard. It wasn't human. It was a deep, guttural snarl that vibrated through the very ground beneath her feet, a sound of pure, untamed fury. It came from Liam. He moved in a blur, shoving Elara behind him as the two shifters lunged. His body seemed to contort and expand. His nails elongated into wicked, black claws that tore through the air. His teeth sharpened into fangs, and his eyes, his beautiful stormy eyes, now blazed with a terrifying golden light. He wasn't the boy she knew anymore. He was the Alpha. He met the first wolf with a savage grace, his claws tearing into the man's shoulder, sending him staggering back with a howl of pain. He spun, ducking under a blow from the second, and slammed his palm into the man's chest with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him crashing into a tree. The forest erupted into chaos. Maya, with a desperate cry, shifted, her form melting and reshaping into that of a sleek, red-furred wolf, and launched herself at another of Kale's enforcers, creating a vital diversion. Kale watched, his expression shifting from confident cruelty to stunned disbelief. He had expected the runaway pup. He had not expected this raw, explosive display of power. This was not weakness. This was the strength of a true alpha, unleashed not for rank or for tradition, but for love. Eli, run! Liam roared, his voice a terrifying mix of man and beast. His command broke her paralysis. He was creating an opening, a desperate, impossible chance. With tears streaming down her face, torn between the instinct to flee and the unbearable urge to stay with him, she turned and ran. Liam fought with a brutal efficiency she could never have imagined, a whirlwind of claws and fangs. He wasn't just defending her, he was unleashing years of repressed rage, of pain and fear, channeling it all into a singular, violent purpose, her survival. He took a deep gash to his arm but didn't seem to notice, his focus entirely on carving a path for her. He threw one last wolf aside and turned to her, his glowing eyes finding hers through the chaos. "Go!" he bellowed, a command that resonated with a power that compelled obedience. Elara didn't look back again. She ran, her lungs burning, the sounds of the vicious fight fading behind her. She fled into the encroaching darkness, her only guide the desperate hope that the boy who was more than human, the alpha who had finally roared, would somehow survive the storm he had unleashed to save her. Chapter 11. The Echo of the Fight. She ran. Elara ran until her lungs were twin fires in her chest and her legs were numb, leaden things that barely belonged to her. The sounds of the fight, the snarling, the sickening tear of flesh, Liam's agonized roar, faded behind her, replaced by the frantic pounding of her own heart and the rasp of her breath in the suffocating silence of the forest. Guilt was a toxic, creeping vine, twisting around her heart. I did this. My words. My stupidity. She had tried to defend him and had instead signed his death warrant, forcing him to reveal his true, violent nature to save her. Had he saved her, only to be killed himself? The thought was a physical blow, and she stumbled, her ankle twisting painfully as she fell to the damp, mossy earth. She lay there, gasping for air, tears of pain and terror carving hot tracks through the dirt on her cheeks. She was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. A human girl, lost in a forest teeming with monsters, her only protector likely captured or worse. Scrambling behind the gnarled roots of a fallen tree, she curled into a tight ball, trying to make herself small, invisible. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The forest, which had been a chaotic symphony of violence, was now eerily quiet. The silence was worse than the noise. It was a void, an unanswered question. Who had won? Was anyone coming for her? She strained her ears, listening for the sound of pursuit, for Kale's triumphant sneer or Liam's familiar footstep. She heard nothing but the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant call of a night bird. She had to move. Staying here was a death sentence. But where could she go? She was completely disoriented, the dense trees a disorienting maze in the deepening twilight. She had no food, no water, no weapon. All she had was the worn copy of Wuthering Heights in her backpack, a tragic, useless relic of a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. Clinging to a sliver of hope, she pushed herself to her feet, her injured ankle protesting with a sharp throb of pain. She had to believe Liam was alive. She had to believe he would find her. That belief was the only thing standing between her and a complete, paralyzing despair. She picked a direction at random, favoring her good foot, and began to limp through the encroaching darkness. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the form of a wolf, every snapped twig sounded like the approach of an executioner. She was no longer a college student, no longer a friend or a daughter. She was prey. And in this vast, dark forest, she was being hunted. Chapter 12. A Hunter's Moon. The night was long and cold. Elara huddled at the base of a cliff face, shivering, the thin sweater she'd grabbed offering little protection against the damp mountain air. Sleep was impossible. Every time she drifted off, the image of Liam's golden, furious eyes would flash in her mind, and she'd jerk awake, her heart pounding. When dawn finally broke, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, it brought with it a gnawing hunger and a desperate thirst. She found a stream, the water so cold it made her teeth ache, and drank until her stomach cramped. Her eyes scanned the undergrowth for anything edible, settling on a patch of dark berries. She remembered a survival show she'd once watched with Liam. He'd have known instantly if they were safe. Taking a desperate chance, she ate a handful, praying they weren't poisonous. The day was spent moving, limping in what she hoped was the direction of a road, a town, any sign of civilization. But the wilderness was relentless, an endless sea of green and brown. The sun arced across the sky, and soon dusk began to fall again. Another night. Another wave of terror. As the moon, a perfect, silver disk, rose above the treetops, a sound drifted through the air that froze her blood. A howl. It wasn't the yipping of a coyote, it was a long, mournful, and powerful cry. A wolf. Was it one of them? A scout searching for her? The sound was filled with a profound loneliness that echoed the hollowness in her own chest. For a wild, desperate moment, she wondered if it was Liam, calling for her. She pressed on, the howl lending a new urgency to her flight. That's when she felt it. A prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The unmistakable feeling of being watched. She stopped, her head whipping around, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. She started walking again, faster this time, and heard it, the distinct, deliberate snap of a twig behind her. Not an animal. Something was following her. Panic seized her, and she broke into a stumbling run, her injured ankle screaming in protest. She didn't get far. A large shape detached itself from the shadows ahead, blocking her path. It was a man tall and broad, with a grizzled gray beard and the most world-weary eyes she had ever seen. He wasn't dressed like Kale's enforcers, he wore practical, worn-out hiking gear. But there was no mistaking the raw power coiled in his frame, the predatory stillness in his stance. He was one of them. Elara braced herself for the attack, but it didn't come. He simply watched her, his expression unreadable. "You're the human girl," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. It wasn't a question. She could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "You've caused a lot of trouble," he continued, his eyes scanning her, taking in her disheveled state. He took a slow step closer, and she flinched back. A flicker of something, pity perhaps, crossed his face. "I am Silas. I was a friend of Liam's mother." The name Liam, on his lips was a shock. "Is he?" She couldn't bring herself to say the word. Silas's expression darkened. "I saw the fight. The boy has the heart of a true alpha. More than his father ever did." He paused, his gaze meeting hers directly. "He's not dead. But he was taken. Kale and his brutes dragged him back to Ronan. Back to the pack." The relief that Liam was alive was so overwhelming it almost buckled her knees. But it was immediately followed by a new, chilling dread. He was a prisoner. A prisoner of his father, the tyrant he had tried so desperately to escape. Chapter 13, An Unlikely Alliance. Silas led her not to a cabin or a house, but to a fissure in a rock face, concealed by a thick curtain of ancient ivy. Inside, a series of caves opened up, surprisingly dry and ventilated. A few furs were laid out for bedding, and a small, smokeless fire pit glowed in the main chamber. It was a Spartan, solitary existence. He said little as he examined her ankle, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth. He handed her a piece of dried meat and a canteen of fresh water, watching with his unervingly steady gaze as she devoured them. "Ronan has ruled through fear for 30 years, Silas said finally, staring into the flames. "He values strength above all else. Compassion, mercy. He sees them as weaknesses." Liam's mother, Elara, my apologies, I never knew her name, was different. She believed our strength was a responsibility, not a right. She argued for a balance with the world, not dominance over it. Ronan tolerated her views, but he never shared them. When she died, that light went out of the pack. He looked up from the fire, his weary eyes finding hers. "I challenged Ronan's leadership after she was gone. For her memory. He made an example of me. Broke me, exiled me. I've been a lone wolf ever since, watching the pack I once loved rot from the inside out." A desperate plan began to form in Elara's mind. "You have to help me," she pleaded, her voice gaining strength. "We have to get him back." Silas let out a short, harsh laugh. "Child, you don't understand. Ronan's compound is a fortress. His enforcers, led by Kale, are a small army of his most loyal, brutal thugs. A man and a human girl walking in there? It's not a rescue mission. It's suicide. I don't care, she insisted, leaning forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity that seemed to surprise him. Liam fought for me. He unleashed everything he hated about himself to give me a chance to escape. I will not abandon him to that monster. She took a shaky breath. You said you were his mother's friend. You said Liam has the heart of a true alpha. If we leave him there, Ronan will either break him or kill him. And that light you talked about will be gone forever. Don't you see? This isn't just about rescuing Liam. It's about saving the soul of your pack. Her words hung in the silence of the cave. She had struck a nerve. He saw her fierce determination, the unwavering loyalty that mirrored his own for Liam's mother. He had been content to live out his days in bitter exile, but this human girl, this catalyst, had brought the war to his doorstep. Liam wasn't just Ronan's son, he was a symbol of his mother's ideals, a chance for a different future. Silas was silent for a long time, his gaze lost in the dancing flames. When he finally looked at her, the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a spark of something he hadn't felt in years, a dangerous, rebellious hope. You are right, he said, his voice a low growl. But we cannot do it alone. Ronan has an army. We will need one of our own. Chapter 14. The Gathering of Rogues. Ronan's rule has created many enemies, Silas explained as they prepared to leave the cave at dawn. Wolves he has exiled, families he has wronged. They are scattered, living in the shadows, trusting no one. They are our only hope. Their journey was a descent into a hidden world. Silas moved with a quiet confidence, leading Elara not along roads, but through the secret pathways of the supernatural. Their first stop was a remote, greasy spoon diner miles from any town, its neon sign flickering like a dying heartbeat. This is neutral ground, Silas whispered as they entered. The woman who runs it, Kala, is an institution. Kala was a tall, sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She moved with an economy of motion, wiping down the counter while her eyes missed nothing. She looked from Silas, whom she clearly recognized, to Elara, her gaze lingering with shrewd curiosity. Silas made the introductions, and Elara found herself telling her story again. Kala listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Elara finished, the older woman placed a cup of coffee in front of her. The whispers are already spreading, Kala said, her voice dry as dust. The Alpha's heir, captured after defending his human mate. Ronan is trying to spin it as a story of human corruption, but some of us know better. We know Ronan. And we know the boy. Her eyes softened slightly as she looked at Elara. It takes a rare courage to stand against a wolf, child. And a rare heart to win the loyalty of one like Liam. Elara felt a strange shift within herself. She wasn't just Liam's terrified friend anymore. Here, in this hidden world, her humanity was not just a weakness, it was a part of the story. Her love for him was the catalyst, the proof that a different way was possible. Kala agreed to help. There are others. Rogues. Outcasts. They pass through here. I'll put the word out, call for a meeting. But be warned, she added, her sharp eyes locking onto Elara. They will not be easily convinced. They have been betrayed by their own kind. Trusting a human will not come naturally. Over the next few days, Elara and Silas traveled, following Kala's cryptic directions to meet other shifters living on the fringes. Elara's role became clear. Silas was the connection to their past, but she was the symbol of their future. She approached them not as a warrior, but as a diplomat, her earnest plea for Liam's life disarming their hardened exteriors. She was no longer a victim in this story. She was a key, unknowingly unlocking a rebellion that had been simmering in the shadows for years. Chapter 15. The Council of the Broken. The meeting place was a circle of ancient standing stones on a wind-swept mountain bald, a place that felt older than memory. Under the cold, silver light of the moon, the outcasts arrived. They materialized from the shadows one by one, a dozen scarred and wary shifters, their eyes filled with the deep, abiding distrust of the betrayed. It was a pitifully small force to challenge an alpha. Silas stood in the center of the circle and laid out the plan. He spoke of Ronan's tyranny, of Liam's capture, of the chance to reclaim the honor of the pack. The rogues listened, their faces impassive, their arms crossed. "Why should we bleed for the son of the man who cast us out?" One of them, a tall shifter with a vicious scar across his face, snarled. "The pup is heir to the throne of our misery. Let him rot." A murmur of agreement went through the small crowd. Their loyalty was to their own survival, not to the lineage that had forsaken them. All eyes turned to Elara, the human standing in their sacred circle. This was her moment, her trial. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. She was surrounded by predators, by beings of immense power and ancient grudges. But fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. "I can't speak to you of pack politics, or honor, or thrones," she began, her voice clear and steady in the crisp night air. "I can only speak about Liam." She told them everything. Not about the werewolf, but about the boy. She told them about his terrible taste in movies, the way he'd sit with her for hours in the library while she studied, his quiet kindness, and the profound loneliness she saw in his eyes even when he was smiling. She described the torment on his face when he told her his secret, his terror not of being a monster, but of being rejected for it. When he fought in that forest, she said, her voice thick with emotion, he wasn't fighting for a title or for power. He was fighting for me. For the simple, human idea that he deserved to be loved for who he is, not for the bloodline he carries. Ronan wants to break him for that. He sees love as a weakness. Her eyes swept the circle, meeting the gaze of each broken wolf. "You were all cast out for being different, for not fitting his mold. Liam is one of you. And I am asking you to help me bring him home." The silence that followed was profound. Her words, spoken from a place of pure human love, had reached past their scars and their anger. A large, heavily scarred shifter Elara recognized as Fawn, the one Kala had told them about, stepped forward. His human mate had been killed years ago on Ronan's orders. His eyes, filled with an old and terrible pain, were fixed on Elara. "My mate was human," he said, his voice a low growl that held the rumble of a rockslide. "She believed in the good in us, even when we couldn't see it ourselves. Ronan called that a weakness." He turned to the others. "This human stands before us, unafraid, and asks us to fight for the very thing we were all condemned for, love. I will not let that light be extinguished again. I fight for the boy." It was the turning of the tide. One by one, moved by Elara's plea and Fawn's powerful endorsement, the others stepped forward, a murmur of assent growing into a chorus of grim determination. They were a small, desperate army, a council of the broken, united by a human girl's unwavering heart. As the moon cast their long shadows across the ancient stones, they began to forge a plan to rescue the prince who had never wanted to be king. Chapter 16. The Eve of the Battle. The air on the mountain bald was thin and cold, charged with the nervous energy of the dozen shifters who had pledged their cause to Liam. The plan was as simple as it was desperate. Fawn, the formidable wolf whose mate Ronan had killed, would lead the main force. They would create a loud, violent diversion at the main gate of Ronan's compound, a frontal assault designed to draw the full attention of Kale and his enforcers. Meanwhile, a smaller team, Silas and Elara, would infiltrate the compound through a weak point, a place no one would think to guard. It was Elara's contribution, a detail dredged from a half-forgotten conversation. One night, months ago, Liam had been complaining about having to help with repairs at his family's estate. He'd griped about a damp, miserable service tunnel that ran from the old well in the woods right into the sub-basement of the main house. "It stinks of mildew and earth," he'd said, "and my father's too proud to admit it's a security flaw." It was a human complaint, a moment of mundane annoyance that had now become the key to their entire operation. As the others engaged in low, guttural conversations, sharpening blades and checking their gear, Silas found Elara sitting slightly apart, her arms wrapped around her knees as she stared at the sliver of moon. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of terror and steely resolve. "He gets his courage from his mother, but he gets his stubbornness from her too," Silas said, his voice a low rumble as he sat beside her. "She was like you. She saw the man, not the wolf. She believed our two worlds didn't have to be at war." He paused, his gaze distant. The day Liam was born, Ronan was proud. But he looked at this tiny baby and all he saw was a future alpha, a continuation of his bloodline. Elara, his mother, she just held him and whispered, "Be a good man, my love. That's all that matters." Ronan never understood that. Silas looked at the human girl beside him, her small frame trembling almost imperceptibly. Liam has spent his whole life trying to honor that wish. He ran, not because he was a coward, but because he was terrified of the monster his father wanted him to become. When he fought for you in that forest, he wasn't just protecting you. He was finally choosing what kind of man he was going to be. Elara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She finally understood. Liam's greatest fear wasn't the violence he was capable of, but that he might one day use it for the wrong reasons, for power, for dominance, the way his father did. But in fighting for her, he had used his monstrous strength to protect an ideal of love and gentleness. He had become the good man his mother had wished for. "I have to get him out," she whispered, her voice fierce. "I have to bring him home." "We will," Silas affirmed, placing a heavy, reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Now get some rest. We move before dawn." Later, curled in a borrowed fur blanket, Elara couldn't sleep. She looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky and thought of Liam, trapped in the heart of his family's darkness. She was terrified, more than she had ever been in her life. But a quiet strength had taken root in her soul. She was no longer just the human girl who had stumbled into a world of monsters. She was Liam's partner, the keeper of his humanity, and she would walk into the wolf's den itself to remind him of the good man he was always meant to be. Chapter 17, Into the Wolf's Den. They moved through the pre-dawn gloom like ghosts, a silent, grim procession. As they neared the valley that held Ronan's compound, the group split. Fun clasped Silas's forearm, a gesture of fierce, warrior-like respect. He then gave Elara a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "For a human, you have the heart of a wolf," it seemed to say. Then he and his small army melted into the trees, circling toward the main gate. Silas led Elara toward the old well Liam had described. The compound was visible through the trees now, a sprawling complex of dark stone and modern architecture that looked more like a prison than a home. It was nestled in the valley, surrounded by a high wall, exuding an aura of cold, oppressive power. They didn't have to wait long. A sudden, deafening roar echoed from the other side of the compound, followed by the crash of splintering wood and the enraged shouts of men. Fun's diversion had begun. Lights flared to life all over the compound, and they could hear the frantic sound of guards running toward the main gate. The trap had been sprung. "Now," Silas grunted, prying the heavy stone lid off the well. The air that wafted up was cold and dank, smelling of wet earth and decay. Silas lit a small, battery-powered lantern, revealing a rusty iron ladder descending into the blackness. "Stay right behind me," he ordered, his voice leaving no room for argument. The descent was terrifying. The ladder was slick with moisture, and the darkness below seemed to swallow the lantern's weak light. When they finally reached the bottom, they were in a narrow, brick-lined tunnel. Water dripped from the ceiling, and the sound of their footsteps echoed unervingly in the confined space. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, but she focused on Silas's broad back, on the mission, on Liam. They moved through the labyrinthine tunnels for what felt like an eternity. Twice, they heard the sounds of footsteps in the corridors above them, and they froze, extinguishing the light and pressing themselves into the shadows until the sounds faded. The distant clamor of Fan's attack provided a constant, terrifying soundtrack to their silent infiltration. Finally, they reached a heavy, iron-barred door. Silas produced a set of lockpicks from his belt, his large fingers working with surprising dexterity. With a quiet click, the lock gave way, and they slipped into the sub-basement of the main house. The air here was different, drier but colder, and tinged with the metallic scent of old blood and something else. A faint, cloying smell of despair. "The holding cells are this way," Silas whispered, his face a grim mask. They crept through darkened corridors, past storerooms and a vast, empty wine cellar. As they descended another flight of stone steps, the feeling of misery intensified. And then Elara heard it. A faint sound, cutting through the distant noise of the battle. A low, pained groan, followed by a dry, rasping cough. It was a sound of profound suffering, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Liam. Her breath caught in a sob, and she surged forward, Silas's hand on her arm the only thing that kept her from sprinting recklessly into the darkness ahead. Chapter 18. The Unbreakable Bond. The cells were carved from the bedrock beneath the house, ancient and formidable. In the last cell, illuminated by a single, flickering bulb, was Liam. The sight of him stole the air from Elara's lungs. He was slumped against the far wall, his head bowed. Heavy, ornate manacles bound his wrists to the stone, the metal glowing with a faint, sickly light. They were silver. He was covered in dirt and dried blood, his face a canvas of bruises, but it was the utter defeat in his posture that broke her heart. "Liam," she breathed, her voice cracking. His head snapped up. His eyes, sunken and dull with pain, widened in stunned disbelief. For a moment, he looked as if he were seeing a ghost. "Eli," he rasped, his voice raw. "No. You can't be here. You have to get out." "I'm not leaving you," she said, rushing to the bars, her fingers wrapping around the cold iron. She could feel the desperate, frantic thrum of his heart, even through the stone and steel. He stumbled towards her, the chains pulling him up short, his own hands reaching out, stopping just inches from hers. "How?" he whispered, his eyes devouring her, checking for injury, for any sign of harm. "Silas," she said, glancing back at the older wolf who was already examining the cell's massive lock. "And others. They're fighting for you." "Fools," Liam groaned, though his eyes shone with a fierce, pained gratitude. "My father will kill them all." "He'll have to get through us first," Silas growled, inserting a long, thin piece of metal into the lock. Just as Silas began to work, heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, fast and purposeful. A large figure appeared at the end of the hall, silhouetted by the dim light. Kale. His face was smeared with blood, not his own, and his lips were pulled back in a triumphant, vicious snarl. "The old dog and the human bitch," he sneered, his gaze dripping with venom as it landed on Elara. "Come to rescue the broken pup. How touching." "Get the door open," Silas said to Elara in a low, urgent voice. He straightened up, turning to face Kale, placing his body between the enforcer and the cell. "This is my fight." "You were always a traitor, Silas," Kale spat, beginning to circle him. "Loyal to a dead woman's memory instead of your alpha." "I'm loyal to the pack," Silas countered, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Something you, a glorified bully, have never understood." While they postured, Elara fumbled in her pocket for the small, sturdy steel file Silas had given her. "The lock is old," he'd said. "Brute force. Aim for the pin." She jammed the file into the lock, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Liam, on the other side of the bars, directed her in a low, strained whisper. "To the left, a little higher. Now push." The fight erupted. Kale lunged, and the two wolves became a blur of savage motion. It was a brutal, desperate dance of claws and fists. Silas was older, but he fought with the wily strength of an exile who had survived decades alone. He was driven by a righteous fury, while Kale fought with the arrogant cruelty of a thug who had never been truly challenged. The clang of their battle was a terrifying counterpoint to the frantic scraping of Elara's file against the lock. The metal groaned in protest. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She could hear Silas grunt in pain as Kale landed a heavy blow. She risked a glance and saw the old wolf stagger, a deep gash on his forehead bleeding freely into his eyes. Kale was grinning, closing in for the kill. "Elara now," Liam roared. With a final, desperate shove, she put all her weight behind the file. There was a loud, sharp crack. The ancient locking pin shattered. The heavy iron door swung inward with a mournful groan, just as Kale raised his claws for a final, fatal blow against Silas. Chapter 19. The Alpha's Choice. Elara didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the cell, ignoring the fight raging behind her. The silver manacles holding Liam glowed with a malevolent energy, searing his skin. Without thinking, she grabbed the heavy cuff on his right wrist and pulled. A searing pain, white-hot and electric, shot up her arms. Silver was poison to werewolves, but even its residual energy was agonizing to a human. She cried out, her skin blistering on contact, but she didn't let go. Her pain seemed to jolt him, a surge of adrenaline cutting through the silver's debilitating effect. He looked at her face contorted in agony for him, and a deep, primal roar was torn from his throat. "I told you I'd eliminate the threat," Cale snarled, having thrown the badly wounded Silas aside. He turned, his eyes wild with victory, and saw Elara at Liam's side. He lunged, not at Liam, but directly at her. Time seemed to bend. As Cale's claws sliced through the air, Liam roared again. With a surge of power that came from the deepest well of his being, he shattered the silver-laced chains. The metal exploded outwards in a shower of glowing shards. The backlash threw him against the stone wall, but he was free. He met Cale's attack with a feral grace that was terrifying and beautiful. This wasn't the blind rage she had seen in the forest. This was controlled, focused, and lethal. Every move was precise, every blow deliberate. He was fighting as a protector, his two halves, man and wolf, finally united in a single, unwavering purpose. He disarmed Cale, breaking his arm with a sickening crack, and slammed him against the wall, his claws at the enforcer's throat. The fight was over. Liam stood panting, his chest heaving, his stormy eyes glowing with a faint golden light. It was then that they arrived. Ronan, the Alpha himself, swept into the dungeons, flanked by 4 of his elite personal guards. He was a larger, older version of Liam, with the same stormy eyes, but his were cold and hard as granite. He took in the scene, the defeated Cale, the wounded Silas, his chained son now free, and the human girl standing defiantly at his side. His face was a mask of cold fury. "So, the traitors reveal themselves," he said, his voice a low, commanding thunder. He looked at Liam, a flicker of disappointment crossing his features. "All this for that?" he sneered, his gaze sweeping over Elara with utter contempt. "A weak, sentimental human." Liam moved, placing himself squarely in front of Elara, shielding her with his body. He looked his father in the eye, and for the first time in his life, there was no fear, only a calm, unshakable certainty. "Her weakness is a strength you've never known," Liam said, his voice ringing with authority in the stone chamber. "It's loyalty. It's compassion. It's love." His gaze hardened. "It's everything you tried to beat out of me, and it's the only thing that makes a leader worthy of the name." He took a step forward, away from the protection of the cell, and stood in the center of the floor. Fun and the other rogues, having breached the compound, appeared at the top of the stairs, a silent, bloody army. "I, Liam, of the blood of Ronan," he declared, his voice resonating with an ancient power, "challenge you. Not for the title of Alpha, but for the freedom of this pack. Your reign of fear is over." Chapter 20, A New Dawn. The challenge hung in the air, a fundamental schism in their world. An Alpha could be challenged, but to challenge the very philosophy of their rule was unprecedented. Ronan looked from his son's defiant face to the army of outcasts standing with him. He saw the hesitation in the eyes of his own guards, men who had followed him out of fear, not loyalty. For the first time, the granite facade of his authority cracked. He was an Alpha with no true pack behind him. His pride was a thing of legend, but he was no fool. To fight his son now, in front of everyone, was a battle he could not win, even if he struck the final blow. Defeated not by claws but by an ideal he could not comprehend, he gave a single, sharp nod. It was a concession. An abdication. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his guards parting before him, leaving him to a self-imposed exile in his own home, a king with no kingdom. Weeks later, a fragile peace had settled over the valley. The compound was slowly transforming. The high walls remained, but the gates were now open. Rogues who had been exiled for decades were cautiously returning, finding not judgment, but a chance to heal. Liam, with Silas and Fan as his trusted counsel, was not ruling but leading. He was building a community based on the strength his father had never understood, unity. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of autumn's end. Elara sat beside Liam on a hill overlooking the valley, watching the warm lights of the compound glow against the twilight. Her hands, though scarred from the silver, were healed. She held a new book, a gift from Liam, but her eyes were on him. The shadows were gone from his face, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He finally looked like he was home. He took her hand, his thumb gently tracing the faint scars on her palm. "You were right, you know," he said softly, his stormy eyes filled with a gentle warmth she knew was reserved only for her. She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I'm right about a lot of things. You'll have to be more specific." A chuckle rumbled in his chest. "In the bookstore. That first night." He turned to face her, his expression serious now, and infinitely tender. "You said it didn't matter if I had relationships where I couldn't make babies. It took me a long time to understand what my mother meant, about being a good man. My purpose isn't to create an heir for a bloodline." He cupped her cheek, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "My purpose is to build a home. A safe place. For everyone who needs one." His voice dropped to a whisper. "With you." He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic desperation or stolen moments, but one of deep, abiding peace. It was a promise of shared sunrises, of facing fears together, of a love that had bridged two worlds and in doing so, had built a new one. In the arms of the boy who was a wolf, the alpha who chose compassion, Elara knew, with every fiber of her being, that she had finally found her own home.